You know what I think is one of the real big issues of this, though, is, and I think this is also very important for understanding why so many people reject evolution and even are nervous about science. I think many people think that if you can explain something through natural cause, that therefore you're saying God had nothing to do with it. And it's interesting that they don't really do this across the board in science. I mean, nobody really cares if, you know, the heart pumps blood, that God is not pushing blood through your veins 24 hours a day. It's perfectly okay for secondary cause to create stuff. We can explain the circulation of the blood through the pumping of the heart, and that's not a problem. You don't say the heart pumps blood and God had nothing to do with it. But when you're talking about evolutionary topics, when you're talking about where animals came from, where human beings came from, and you're using, as we do in all of science, you're using natural cause to explain this, a lot of people sort of put that thought in, that, oh, you're explaining that dogs and bears have a common ancestor. Oh, you're explaining the similarities between dogs and bears by evolution. You're saying God had nothing to do with it. Oh, you're looking at humans and chimps and showing how similar they are, and you were inferring they have a common ancestor. You're saying God had nothing to do with it. And actually we aren't. We're not saying God did or did not have anything to do with it, because in science you set God aside. You don't say he categorically had nothing to do with it, but you set supernatural powers aside, not because all scientists are atheists, but because we can't test those explanations. If you say God did it, maybe God did do it, but you can't test it. In science, what you have to do is test your explanations. And any result you got from a test, where you're using God as your dependent variable, so to speak, any result you got is compatible with God's actions. One of the things that is absolutely essential about the scientific way of knowing is that we test our explanations against the natural world. One of the critical aspects of testing is that you hold constant certain variables. You know, if I want to know whether the fertilizer works in the cornfield, I make sure that both cornfields have the same amount of water. I hold constant the amount of water, and I just vary the amount of fertilizer. And if I get more corn, then I conclude the fertilizer is efficacious. Fine. If you are trying to use God as an explanation in science, how do you hold constant God's action? God, please don't interfere with the corn plot. Good luck. You can't put God in a test tube or keep him out of one for all of that. You can't hold constant the acts or the efforts of an omnipotent force. Therefore, we can't test explanations using God. So because we can't test those explanations, we just set them aside. It's not the same thing as saying God had nothing to do with it. It's just saying when we're wearing our scientist hat, we have to limit ourselves to just the things we can test. Once we invent the theometer, maybe we can, but lacking a theometer, we have to just muddle along best we can with natural cause. Evolution is used in a lot of areas that would probably come as a surprise to most Americans. It's used in agriculture and food production. It's used in medicine, where we're trying to combat infectious diseases, which are evolving all the time. It's also used in our management of natural resources, because ecosystems also change through time. Ecosystems also evolve. If we're going to do a good job in biotech or in feeding our nation as well as the rest of the world, if we're going to do a better job in preserving the planet, we better know those evolutionary principles, because they're involved in all of those. When William Jennings Bryan was arguing his point of view in the Scopes trial, he basically made the same 3 points that modern-day creationists also make in pushing their particular agenda. He argued that evolution was weak science, that scientists were giving up on evolution. It wasn't being supported as strongly as it, used to be. And of course, creationists today are constantly arguing that evolution is weak science, which is complete nonsense. Brian argued that evolution and religion were incompatible. That remains one of the current pillars of creationism. And he argued a form of the fairness argument, which was that local people should make the decision about what should be taught in school rather than the experts, on the grounds that he who pays the piper calls the tune, and since local people were paying for the teachers, they should decide what the teachers should teach. That is a kind of variant of the fairness argument that you hear so much from creationists today, that it's only fair to teach both views. It's good pedagogy, perhaps, good critical thinking to have the students evaluate both points of views and so forth. And of course, the argument that we would make in response is that it is profoundly unfair to pretend to students that there's an actual scientific controversy going on about whether evolution took place. And if you present all this misinformation that the creationists come up with to support their contention that there is a controversy out there in science, you really are miseducating students. The general public is going to receive its information about science from many different sources. Some of it will be actual classroom kinds of occurrences, such as school or college, university. They'll also pick up an awful lot about science from magazines, from books written by scientists or journalists, and they're going to pick up a fair amount from popular culture in general, things like movies or television shows and so forth. I think scientists can play a lot larger role than they have played in all of these areas. And I think what's required is that scientists reach out more to television and movies and these other sources of information that people get, because there's a great deal of misinformation both about evolution as well as about how science works and how scientists work. Very infrequently do you see scientists on television. A recent difference in that general statement is the various forensic scientists that you're seeing on television a lot. And actually those shows can do a pretty good job in showing how scientists think, kind of the reasoning process, which actually has to do with eliminating various possible explanations until you finally have the explanation that you can't eliminate, and you hold on to that provisionally. And that's actually pretty good modeling of how science is done. But there's not very much on television, in your basic series that people watch all the time, about evolution itself, which is too bad. I think different people will react differently to what's available to them in science. There are lots of books out there. There are a lot of magazines like Discover and Scientific American and Smithsonian and Natural History. There are a lot of places where if people are interested in science, they can learn more. Now, some people are not very interested in science from the get-go, and so it's very difficult to persuade them that this is one of those eat your broccoli kinds of moments where it's kind of hard to persuade them that they should learn about science. That may be expecting too much, which is why I think that maybe if we had a little bit more positive presentation of scientists and what they do on the popular media, especially television, but also radio, that might help people understand that science really is quite interesting, and even if they don't have very much background, they can enjoy it. Many people enjoy music without really knowing the difference between the 17th century and the 18th century in terms of which was the Romantic period and which was the Classical period and so forth. But they can still enjoy music. Well, you can still enjoy learning about science. You can still enjoy the discoveries of science and how the fascination of natural history without necessarily knowing much about molecules or the structure of DNA or any of the other details of science. And I would hope that maybe we could interest more of the public in this subject, but some people are simply not going to be interested. There's not going to be much we can do. I think the average citizen should appreciate the three aspects of evolution. the big idea that living things had common ancestors, which is kind of the overarching idea of biological evolution. But I think the public should also understand natural selection as the most important mechanism of evolution. And also, natural selection is very important if you're going to understand the applications of evolution in agriculture or biotech, medicine, and so forth. But I think just for pure fascination, most people are very interested in that third aspect of evolution, which is the pattern or the phylogenies, the tree of life. I think many people are fascinated by the way that life has branched and radiated through time. And, you know, what is the relationship of birds to dinosaurs? Or what is the relationship of vertebrates to invertebrates? Or what is the relationship of land vertebrates to fish and so forth? And I think that all three of those, a little bit of an understanding of all three of those areas would be, I think, very, very useful to people. And then as they were more interested in one part or another, they could delve more deeply. I think that if someone, like many high school students today, gets through school without ever having heard the E word, that person really is missing a very large chunk of their science literacy, because evolution is an idea that permeates virtually all of science. A student who doesn't understand that the stars and galaxies and the moons and planets that he sees at night when he looks up in the sky, that all of these phenomena have evolved, I think is missing a certain amount of depth and appreciation for how absolutely fascinating this universe is. The same thing with geological structures. Just speaking personally, I have taken a couple of trips down Grand Canyon, and it's really made me look at rocks very, very differently. I was visiting a natural site in Kentucky that I had worked in a number of years ago before I went to Grand Canyon. And when I passed through this tunnel into the Red River Gorge area there, I was just struck by all the geology that I'd never noticed before. I mean, I'd noticed the river and I'd noticed the plants and I'd looked around for the animals, but I hadn't really paid any attention to the rocks before. And then I went to Grand Canyon and I began to realize how really significant geology is in terms of understanding all of nature. And so I look with very different eyes now at even places that I knew very well and thought I understood. I look at them with a new appreciation. And I think most people, once they understand evolution, will indeed look at nature very differently from how they had looked at it before. And so evolution in one sense is a practical kind of understanding because it is relevant to things like medicine and agriculture and so forth. But it also has an aesthetic component to it as well. I think you really appreciate nature and you appreciate how fascinating this planet is if you understand that it has in fact evolved. Poll after poll has shown that something like high 40%, 46, 47, 48% of people have some measure of special creationist view, that God created everything all at one time in its present form. That is just shocking and a real indictment against science education. Somehow or another, we are not getting across to students at the appropriate age an extremely basic, fundamental concept of science. It's almost as if we were teaching them that it didn't matter whether things fell up or fell down, and expected them to be scientifically literate, not understanding gravitation. No, it's completely shocking to believe this, but that's what we have here in the United States. We have a big job to do to correct that. I think we need to do a better job in K-12 science education to help students understand both the nature of science as well as more about the science of evolution itself and how the two fit together. And I think in order to do that, we have to do a whole lot better job of teaching evolution at the college level, because those college professors are not doing a good enough job teaching evolution. And we know that because the kids that they teach at the college level who then go on to become teachers don't know enough about evolution to properly teach it. So the buck stops with the university professor, in my opinion. But I think there also are other things that we can do, because school is not the only place where you learn about evolution or science at all. It would help to have more articles written in newspapers and magazines. It would help to have more radio programs in which people would call in and ask questions about evolution or about science in general. It would help if we had more television programs in which science was the theme. I think people who tend to go into the arts, people who tend to go into television and movies, tend to have a humanities background rather than a science background. And so they tend to be a little nervous about using science themes. But I think the science community would be happy to help them with it, so that they would do it accurately but still do it in an entertaining fashion, because that's the goal, obviously. I think it could be done. And I think that helping the public understand more about evolution would be very enjoyable to the public, because this is a fascinating area of study. You know, there's so many things that go on, so many discoveries in evolution that if you know something about the field, you hear about these discoveries and you just go, wow, that is just so cool, I want to know more. But the public doesn't hear them and the public doesn't know about them. I'd like to kind of share that excitement with them, and I think it can be done. I think that in a modern industrial society like the United States or Great Britain or Japan or Europe, if the citizenry does not understand science, then that citizenry is not going to be making good decisions. In a democratic society like ours, we depend upon the citizens making good decisions. We have to make decisions about science and technology all the time. We have to make decisions about the environment, about how we use the environment, how we exploit it, how we protect it, whether we protect it, what we do with it. And those kinds of decisions need to be informed by science. Now, science is not going to determine those decisions. In many cases, the science provides us with a controversial topic like stem cells that we have to decide about, and the actual science itself is not going to be depository. We have to use our ethical and moral systems to make many of these decisions, but they should be informed by science. Accurate science and clear understanding of science needs to be extant among the population before they can apply those ethical and moral precepts. So I would hope that we would become more scientifically literate as a population. I read a study once where an investigator took a poll of people and asked them questions about their understanding of science and their understanding of how science worked. And he was able to kind of divide the group into those who really knew very little about science and understood very little about how science really operated, and a group that was more scientifically literate. The two groups differed a great deal in some very profound ways. The group that didn't understand science very well or didn't think very scientifically tended to have more of a magical way of looking at life. They seemed to feel that fate was much more in charge than they were, and that there wasn't a whole lot they could do to affect you know, the rest of their lives. It was a very fatalistic kind of way of looking at the world. Now, if we have a whole society full of people like that, that's very bad, because we depend, in a democratic society like the United States, we depend on people who feel that decisions and actions have consequences, that there is this cause and effect relationship in the world, and that if I vote for a particular senator that has this policy, this is going to happen. If I vote against that person, I may be preventing a policy. There has to be this feeling that my actions can have an effect on the world in order for us to have a democratic society. And to some degree, understanding the kind of cause and effect basis of science and thinking in terms of testing explanations against the natural world, of critically thinking about things, of evaluating ideas and testing to see which ones are most useful and which ones are most valid. I think all of that is very important, just in terms of having a democratic society, because we depend on one another and we each have one vote. And I would really hope that those votes are being cast, and the decisions that are made by our representatives, as well as just the man on the street, are being made with some kind of concept of critical thinking. Because goodness knows we have plenty of opportunities to make bad decisions. And that's to the detriment of our health, our welfare, our environment, of virtually everything that we think is important in the United States. I think that science is definitely under siege today. When I read about the politicization of the scientific decision-making process in Washington, it's very scary and very upsetting. When I read about the appointment of committees that are supposedly offering neutral scientific or scientifically valid advice, and I see that those committees are being stacked with people who are ideologically one position or another, that's very upsetting. When I see that the decision makers in Washington have cut back seriously on research, on data collection, on the information that must be available to congressmen in order to make good, sound, empirically based decisions. I get very distressed about that as well. I think there are a lot of assaults on science in the current political climate, and I find it very, very disturbing. I think most scientists would.